Go ahead and get started here. Before I begin, is there anything that we need to pray for, any prayer requests? All right, then, we'll go ahead and get started with the word of prayer. Father, we thank you so much for this day and for everything that you have done on our behalf. We appreciate that you have sent your Son to come to earth and live as one of us so that he may teach us and help us understand the right way to live. We thank you for his death and his burial and resurrection that is chronicled in the Gospel of Mark. And we thank you for the wisdom that has been left behind for our benefit that tells us of those events. We pray that as we're going through this and studying today, that you would help us to readily receive the word in the manner in which it was intended and to have a deeper understanding of it so that we may grow closer to Christ and closer to you. All these things we pray in the name of your beloved Son. Amen. Now, for those of you that have not noticed, I am not Nate. Nate is actually back with the college students and teaching their class this morning, especially since this is the big welcome back for all the college students. So he asked me to pinch hit for him. You know, he's hit a great game, but still he needed somebody else to do the base running to bring us home. So hopefully I'll be able to do that this morning. And so I remember he told me when he asked me to cover Mark chapters 15 and 16, before I even said anything, he preemptively said, I know that's a lot of content, but I think you can handle it. So it is a lot of content. I may not ask as many questions as I normally do. If you've been in my classes before, I may not do that quite as often this morning because there is a lot to get through, but I will be asking a few, so we will try to cover this material. There's no way that we can cover it in the depth that you could, but this will be just sort of a good general summary and survey over the Gospel of Mark, the last two chapters in that account. So we'll start out with Mark 15, 1 through 5. Early in the morning, the chief priest with the elders and scribes and the whole council immediately held a consultation, and binding Jesus, they led him away and delivered him to Pilate. Pilate questioned him, Are you the king of the Jews? And he answered him, It is as you say. The chief priest began to accuse him harshly. Then Pilate questioned him again, saying, Do you not answer? See how many charges they bring against you? But Jesus made no further answer. So Pilate was amazed. Now, as we're starting this story out, we can see that one of the things that Mark is trying to do here is create a clear contrast between Jesus talking with the Pharisees and Jesus talking with Pilate. And so we see that he kind of makes this break, and even though it's brief and it doesn't give us a ton of information, he gives us this break between these two conversations that are happening. We've already seen in the past chapter, you remember where we left off in Mark 14, that some of his conversations and the trial that has happened with the Pharisees has already occurred. And so now what we're seeing is that after that has occurred, he's now having this conversation, brief conversation. It's not chronicled nearly as in-depth as, for example, the Gospel of John, but he is talking to Pilate, and he does talk to Pilate differently than he does the chief priest and the Jewish elders. And I think a lot of this has to do with, we could speculate on why he's doing this, and I think that there's multiple reasons and multiple good answers to the question of why there is this distinction being drawn by the Gospel of Mark between his conversation and the way he talks to Pilate versus the way he talks to the chief priest. But I think a lot of it goes back to the pearls before swine comment he makes, not in the Gospel of Matthew, not in the Gospel of Mark, but in Matthew chapter 7, verse 6. You'll remember there in the Sermon on the Mount, he advises his disciples not to cast his pearls before swine. And the reason that he's making that illustration is that when you do so, you're essentially wasting something that is good. And the reason that I think it's making this break between the two is he does talk to the Pharisees a little bit, but he never really tries to deny their accusations. He doesn't really try to defend himself. And I think it's ultimately that he knows where the chief priests are going to fall anyway. As he sort of illustrates before they bring him into trial. You remember that long conversation he's having with the Pharisees on the days leading up to the Passover, where he's going to be crucified. He's already had a lot of these conversations. He's given them ample opportunity. He has shown them all the evidence that they would ever need to know to prove that he is the Messiah. And he's just at the point to where, really, if they're already willing to do all this, to come at him, like he said, a thief in the night, as though he's some kind of robber or vagabond that hasn't been teaching in public this entire time, they're already doing all this cloak and dagger stuff. They have no interest in letting Jesus go, and he knows that ahead of time. And so because of it, you're seeing this very different sort of attitude between how he's talking to the chief priest and how he's talking to Pilate. So Pilate asks him a question, and he just flat out answers him very straightforwardly, yes, it is as you say. And so I think that that's interesting, that he's having a much more upfront, honest conversation with Pilate, because I think he understands that Pilate is at least somewhat more open to the possibility that there might be more here than he is understanding. And it's also interesting the verbiage that is used here too. He says, "Are you king of the Jews?" Now, it records this accurately because this is what Pilate is saying, but you have to understand, Pilate, unlike, Herod, for example, because Herod, of course, is a governor and a king, but he is also well-versed in a lot of the Jewish customs, phraseology, that kind of thing. Pilate's not like that. Pilate is a prefect, and they typically only stayed in one particular area for about a decade, which means that what we're seeing here is that Pilate is a thoroughly Roman official and an individual. He doesn't think like a Jew. He doesn't know a lot about their customs. And so the reason that the chief priests have come to him with this accusation, this man is king of the Jews, is because that's the language he understands. You have to understand they're essentially saying this is the Messiah. That's how you would have said that to a Roman sensibility, that he is claiming to be the king of the Jews, and they're also doing it in such a way that it is going to have the maximum impact on the Romans, because they've already accused and sentenced Jesus to death because of blasphemy. But they know that if they come to Pilate, it's like, we have to stone this man because he's a blasphemer, he's going to say, get out of here with that. He doesn't care about that. What he does care about is somebody trying to create an uprising within his jurisdiction, because that's going to cause all kinds of problems for him and for the Romans. And so they have to nail him on some kind of charge. They just have to essentially drum up a charge that they know that the Romans will actually care about, so that they can get him so that they can get the Romans to do their dirty work and execute him. And if you look in the records, historical records actually affirm this, that whenever king of the Jews is used, that's actually referring to, it's basically the Roman equivalent of saying he's the Messiah. Even Josephus, who is not a Christian by any stretch of the imagination, who writes around the time of Christ, actually uses that phrase and confirms that that's how you would have said Messiah to a Roman individual. And you'll remember that in Mark 14:64, they have accused him of blasphemy already, but they there were accusing him of saying that he was the Messiah, even though he was not the Messiah. And now they're coming to Pilate saying, this guy is the Messiah. So it's interesting that they're kind of talking out of both sides of their mouth, because in private, when they're in their own council, they're saying he's a blasphemer because he's saying he's the Messiah when he's not. And then when they go to Pilate and he asks, well, what has this guy done wrong? He's like, well, he's the Messiah. That's the problem. And so it's funny that they're really playing both sides of the aisle here. They're saying whatever is convenient to get the result that they want at the time, regardless of the fact that it kind of weirdly contradicts itself. So this is the question I do want to ask about this. Why do you think it is recorded there in verse 5? It says that Jesus made no further answer and Pilate was amazed. What has amazed Pilate about this conversation, this interaction he's had with Jesus? Well, I mean, that would be the obvious one, sure. So I think you're exactly right. Jesus is not making a defense for himself. Jesus is not a stupid person, and I think Pilate can perceive that pretty quickly. He knows that, Pilate has the power to execute him if he wants to. And despite the fact that the stakes are quite high, Jesus isn't saying anything to try to keep that outcome from happening. I think if anybody were, had the death penalty hanging over them, they would at least say something to try to avoid that, but Jesus doesn't say anything. Any other reasons that this might amaze Pilate? Is there anything else? And by the way, I'm not fishing for any one particular answer. Yes, Jim? Okay, I think that that's a very, valid thing to bring up. Jesus has been extremely public about his ministry so far, which means that Pilate, his job is to be aware of things that are going on around him in his jurisdiction. And so if that is the case, he's certainly heard of Jesus by this point. Pretty much everybody in the province of Judea probably had at this point, just based on the way that the Bible reads. And so one of the reasons he might be amazed is there's a subversion of expectation. So there's these expectations that Pilate had, probably a picture in his head of what Jesus would look like, how he would act, how he would talk, that kind of thing. And yet, he meets him, and those expectations are not met. This is a different kind of person than he was expecting. And it's also important to note that Pilate has probably dealt with rebels and people who had been trying to undermine Roman rule. He's met zealots that have tried to assassinate Roman officials, things like that. He has dealt with this before because from what we know from the historic record, Pontius Pilate started his time in Judea around AD 26. So this is actually close to the end of his tenure as a prefect of Judea, which means that he's been here for a while now. He's not a newcomer. He may not know all of the intricacies of the law of Moses and all of the cultural things, and based on some of the historians that we see, this guy really hates Jews. He does not like Jews at all. He finds them a rebellious people, and that's the reason that we see from historic records that he deals very harshly with them. But nonetheless, we understand all of that, and then Pilate is expecting this messianic figure, probably expecting, this is just another claimed Messiah, this is another person leading a rebellion, he's going to be just like all the others, and he's not. And so, much like a lot of the other people we see in the Gospels, people were expecting one thing out of Jesus, and then when they actually meet him, he's completely different. And so I think that has a lot to do with Pilate's reaction there as well. Let's go ahead and move on to verses 6 through 10. Now at the feast, he used to release for them any one prisoner whom they requested. The man named Barabbas had been imprisoned with the insurrectionist who had committed murder in the insurrection. The crowd went up and began asking him to do as he had been accustomed to do for them. Then Pilate answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he was aware that the chief priest had handed him over because of envy. So Mark includes this detail about Barabbas, and he gets very specific in what Barabbas has done. So he's not just an insurrectionist, somebody who tried to overthrow Roman rule from Judea. It also includes the detail of he's committed murder in pursuit of that goal, which would mean that this is not just somebody who was a patsy that the Romans put up or the Jewish priest put up like Jesus, who just kind of drummed up charges, or somebody that was in the wrong place at the wrong time, or has some sort of circumstantial evidence against him, or maybe just spoke out against Caesar and that's the reason he got hauled into prison. No, this is a person that believes it. He's somebody that went so far to kill another man, to take his life, in order to see the goal of Judea being freed from Roman control. Now, we don't know if he killed like another Jew, a Roman official, but the reason that Mark is bringing this up is because it's trying to show this is not just some random prisoner that happened to be nabbed by the Roman officials that was in the wrong place at the wrong time. This is somebody that really is a villain, somebody that really did commit the things that Rome is accusing him of. And so it's drawing this contrast between Jesus, who they had to have this secret trial in the dead of night and drum up all these charges and try to find false witnesses and all these things. It's the exact opposite of what happened to Barabbas. This guy was caught in the act. We know what he did. And so it's drawing that because it's trying to emphasize, really, I think, the position that we all find ourselves in when coming up to the cross. He's the guilty one. And yet what's going to happen to him that we know in a few minutes is he's going to be let off, and Jesus is going to be executed in his stead. And the reason that Mark is emphasizing that is it's trying to show that the guilty one gets pardoned and the innocent one is killed. Which, if you really think about it, that's a pretty apt summary of every Christian's relationship with Christ. We're the guilty ones, and we get to walk away with a pardon because Jesus takes our place on the cross. And so that's why Mark is really emphasizing and driving this home that this is not just some innocent bystander that happened to get caught up in circumstances beyond his control. No, this is someone who knew exactly what he was doing and did so to the point that he was willing to take another life in the pursuit of that cause. It's also important to remember, too, that these are Romans that Mark is writing to, so they understood culturally even better than probably the Jews. If a Jew had been reading this that had never seen Rome, they were all familiar with Roman culture to an extent because they're being ruled by Rome. But when Mark is relaying these customs, now Mark is the briefest of all the gospel writers, of course, but part of the reason that you're seeing a lack of detail in some of these spots without explaining a whole lot is because Mark understood the people he's writing to have a Roman background anyway. And so because of that, he can kind of skip over a lot of the intricate details because they're Romans that would have already understood a lot of this stuff. And so we're seeing a very quick trial here with Pilate, but that's because the Romans already knew what these proceedings were going to look like. And so he doesn't really feel the need to elaborate too much to his audience here. And then we also see in verse 10, it tells us that Pilate really is on to the Jewish leaders. You know, Pilate's not a stupid person either. And he's looking at this and he can tell pretty quickly. He's had only a brief conversation with Jesus, and of course we have more details about that, for example, in John's gospel, where we get the whole conversation between them about what is truth. But the point in all of that is that Pilate, he's on to the Jews. He knows what they're trying to do. He knows they're just trying to use him as a hangman to get rid of a guy that they don't like. Because here's the thing. Does anybody think that Pilate is really stupid enough to believe that the Jewish elders are like really deeply concerned about the standing of Rome within Judea? That they really want to show their loyalty to Rome by turning over every insurrectionist and every rebel that doesn't like the fact that Rome is ruling over Judea? No, he doesn't believe that. He knows better than that. He doesn't like the Jews don't like him. That, you know, they're honest about their relationship. It may kind of be an open secret, but the point is, they know what's going on here, and because of that, Pilate has figured out pretty quickly, is like, this is an innocent guy. They're not actually trying to uphold justice or protect me or, you know, defend Caesar or anything like that. What they're doing is they're trying to use me because he knows they can't actually execute capital punishment. We know from Roman law and Roman historians that that was the one thing that Rome was like, no, you can't kill anybody. That's our job. We bear the sword. And so because of that, Rome was very strict, and that was one of the very few things that they didn't, because Rome typically allowed quite a bit of leeway for local jurisdiction. That was the one thing that they were like, nope, if you want to execute somebody, we have to be the ones to approve that. And so because of that, he understands what's going on here. He's not hiding the ball. He knows that the Jews really are about just getting rid of this guy because of what Mark's gospel says here, envy. And so it's interesting that we've seen Mark doing all these contrasts between these various parties and various characters involved. Jesus is the only one who is not playing games or has some kind of ulterior motive hiding underneath the surface. He's the only one, because the Jews are trying to use the Romans are trying to appease the Jews, and so Pilate is going to go to the crowd and try to appeal to them and try to do an end run around the chief priest so that he can talk to the people directly, and then the people will side with him and turn against the chief priest, or at least that's his plan anyway. And so all of these things are going and all these games are playing, and nobody's actually being honest except for Jesus. Everybody else has all these secret motives that they're trying to get done, that they're pretending to be something that they're not, or pretending they have some other motive, when ultimately Christ is the only one that's actually being honest here. So let's go ahead and look at the next couple verses, 11 through 15. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to ask to him to release Barabbas for them instead. Answering again, Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with him who you call the King of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." But Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But then they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." Wishing to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas for them, and after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. So this is actually a pretty good illustration, and I'm not trying to delve off into the political, but I think that the two kind of intersect here. The people are the problem. Pilate had this idea in his head that what he's going to do is, well, this dude's clearly innocent. And so if I just put him in front of the crowd, and the crowds are not the chief priests, and they don't have this reason of envy to go against him, and so if I present, these guys, if I can present to the people Jesus versus Barabbas, then surely they're going to pick the guy that's actually innocent to have me release them to him. And so this is kind of a sneaky way of him turning the Jews on their own leaders. But what he didn't anticipate is that the people are pretty easily corrupted. Because remember, these are largely the same people that 7 days before this are welcoming Jesus in as a king on Palm Sunday and joyous about him coming into Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, and now they're wanting him executed. As John Adams said, this is the reason that democracy always commits suicide, and it's the reason that we don't have a democratic form of government, is because ultimately the people are the problem. And this is something that is expressed in the Bible over and over and over again. Are there bad kings of Israel? Absolutely. Is there bad leadership all throughout the Bible? 100%. But when you boil it all down, the leaders are a reflection of the people. And the people ultimately are the problem. And this verse kind of illustrates that Pilate was going to try to appeal to the better angels of the Jewish people, and then finds out fairly quickly, no, they'd really rather just listen to their leaders and go along with whatever they're going to say. And so that really became the issue here. And so this really brings us to an interesting question. It's clear that Pilate is trying to manipulate the system and do things to get Jesus, keep him from being executed. So is Pilate actually trying to do the right thing here?
An argument could absolutely be made in that regard because, as we mentioned earlier, he right away brought the pick upon the nonverbal cues of Jesus and said, what reason apart from no good, real reason did they bring you here? But even at the end, I think even in Matthew, he took a bowl of water, and was just like, I've had enough at the end of it, because he clearly was trying to do the right thing, not from what we consider a religious perspective, but just trying to do the simple, where's the judge and jury in this case? This man has clearly done nothing wrong, so why wouldn't I release him?
Yeah.
When the crowd is saying, saying, they're making it very clear that they're out for blood, then, as would any human probably, he capitulated, it's just like, y'all take care of that.
Right, so I do think on some level you're correct that he doesn't really have a religious reason, per se, like maybe the Jews would for letting Jesus go. But he does have some sense of right and wrong. And he has some sense of moral obligation. That's a good way to put it. And so because of that, he does feel convicted that this guy is going to die on his watch, and he seems to not want that to happen. So there is some level at which Pilate is, I think, trying to do the right thing on some level. I think we can give him credit for that, but here's the problem. Ultimately, he is a coward, and he capitulates to the will of the people, and this is something we see all throughout the biblical narrative. Why is Saul so much a worse king than David? Well, if you look at every mistake that is chronicled that Saul made, every single one, the excuse he gives is, well, the people wanted this. And now, is it maybe that Saul is using that as cover to hide the fact that he really wanted to do what the people wanted him to do, and he's just blaming the people? Yeah, that's probably the case. But whether it is or not, the point is, he morally caved to the will of the people, and we see this over and over again in various places. I don't think Pilate is malicious, and I don't think he has anything against Jesus. I think he actually is trying to help Jesus out, But at the end of the day, he's not going to risk his own neck for it. He understands that doing the right thing is going to cost him something, and because of that, he's not willing to do it. So in some ways, I do think that Pilate does have a sense of morality here, but ironically, that almost makes it worse. Because it would be one thing if Pilate felt no moral obligation whatsoever and just yeah, you can kill him, it's fine. It's no skin off my hide. As bad as that would have been, on some ways it would have been more honest. Because at this point, Pilate knows that there is something amiss here and something wrong, but because it's going to cost him, he just decides to go ahead and do it anyway. And in some ways, that's morally worse. Jim? Sorry, what was that? Political expediency. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. At the end of the day, he knows what the right thing is, but he knows this other thing is going to be better for his career, so he does that. See, that's the problem with a lot of people in the Bible. They know the right thing to do, but just like us, sometimes they're tempted by the fact that, well, doing the right thing is going to cost me something, so I'm going to do this other thing. And so that's really where Pilate has a moral failing here. And really, I think that is what Mark is trying to put on display for his readers. He's showing these two men, Pilate and Jesus, next to one another. Pilate is not even willing to risk his job, and not even necessarily losing his job, but maybe just, his bosses being disappointed with him, whereas Jesus is willing to die to do the right thing. And that's the difference in the two of them. If you want a dichotomy, a separation between the two of them, a contrast, that's it. Jesus has the ultimate courage. Pilate has no courage. He's not even willing to suffer minor inconveniences to do the right thing. And I think, unfortunately, that's a testament to where a lot of us are from time to time as well. Where we come down to it where I want to do the right thing, and I know that this is the right thing to do, but that's going to cost me. And unfortunately, sometimes we don't make the right decision because of that. But Mark is saying here, if you want to do the right thing, if you want to live the kind of life that Jesus did, you have to be willing to make the ultimate sacrifice, if it means doing what God wants you to do. And so that's the difference between the two of them. All right, so let's go ahead and look at the next few verses. The soldiers took him away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and they called together the whole Roman cohort. They dressed him up in purple, and after twisting a crown of thorns they put on him, they began to acclaim him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They kept beating his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling and bowing before him. After they had mocked him, they took the purple robe off of him and put his own garments on him, and they led him out to crucify him. If you understand the historic context here, one thing that's important to note is this thing that they're doing, where they're putting the crown of thorns on and putting on the purple robe, this is actually kind of a parody of something they would have been familiar with, because remember, he's no longer in Jewish custody. The Romans have him at this point. And so this very much parallels the coronation ceremony of a Hellenistic vassal king. And so they have the reed on his head. Now, you may have seen in Greek sculptures and statues, and that was sort of adopted by Rome later, you'll see different individuals or various Caesars that have wreaths around their head, the leaves coming off the side of their head like that. Well, that's because that's how you coronated a vassal king who was under the emperor of Rome. Or the same thing in the Greek. If you ruled a city-state, they were often depicted with the leaves around their head because that was a sign of royalty. And so I don't think that it's the way that a lot of people have sort of described the crown of thorns. Is it a parody? Absolutely. Is this done to mock and make fun of him? Sure. Is a crown of thorns uncomfortable? Absolutely. But it's probably not like a torture device like it's often been depicted as. They're not necessarily going for, we're going to make this as painful as possible. I'm sure it was painful, don't get me wrong. But they're really doing it more so because it's a mockery of royalty. And because he's referred to himself as King of the Jews, they're trying to do this thing that they find really funny, where they take basically a weed, and a plant that would be unpleasant, a crown of thorns instead of a crown of leaves. And so they're really just kind of making a joke out of Jesus at this point. It's not really done to hurt him. Now, they obviously are hurting him because they're beating him in the head with a reed. So they're not being gentle with him, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying that this is really done more to mock the position that he's in. And really, when you boil it down, this is kind of just a much more brutal equivalent of the Romans cheering for their own team. Like, this is kind of how sports fans will taunt one another. If you've ever seen, for example, some of those game day t-shirts that you'll have with like Auburn or Alabama whenever one of them wins the Iron Bowl, where it'll have like, if Alabama won, it's this big strong elephant and he's like kicking this little kitten or whatever that looks like a tiger, and it's supposed to depict Auburn as weak and frail. This is just kind of the Roman equivalent of that. They're saying, oh, you want to claim to be the king, you want to be the person that's going to challenge Rome? Yeah, well, we're going to do this parody of what a king would look like, and we're going to mock you in that way. And so this is really just done more for sport than anything else. But there is a interesting irony here. People who think they have power mocking somebody who actually does have power. And so there's an interesting dichotomy there. This is a weird analogy, but I think it kind of fits here. It sort of reminds me of this scene in one of the episodes of Spectacular Spider-Man, where some of the bullies are hanging out in the school and they're like on the second or third floor, and they start throwing water balloons at him. And Peter is unaware of this, and then his spider sense kicks in and he just jumps out of the way because he didn't know that it was a water balloon. He just sensed there was something, and so because of that, he jumps out of the way, and all the kids are like looking around and staring at him because he just, did this sort of acrobatic flip out of the way to avoid the water balloon. And then, now that he knows that it's a water balloon, he's like, now I have to take one. Because he has the power to dodge it. And he doesn't want to get hit by the water balloon, but he knows, because he has to keep his identity a secret, now he's got to take one in order to get to that goal. Now, this is a much more extreme example of that, but it's kind of the same thing. Because Jesus knows he has the power to end this, the embarrassment, the mockery, and then eventually the crucifixion, the pain that he's going to go through. At every second through this process, Jesus knows I could make this end anytime I want to. And yet he has the restraint and the self-control to not do that. He's essentially doing the same thing on a more extreme level. He's going to take one right in the face, knowing that he could avoid it the entire time because it's the right thing to do. And so there's a contrast between these two, Roman soldiers who think they have all the power and think they have all the control here. They're going to find out one day they actually don't. And I mean, hopefully these Roman soldiers actually became Christians themselves. I don't know that. There's no reason to believe that. But the point is, eventually you're going to figure out who actually does have the power. It kind of reminds me, and this is sort of a personal story that this came up in my mind. A lot of you may know that I did debate back in high school. And I did that through the FFA, and we went on to do really well at the Nationals. We were one of the top performing teams there, and we came within an eyelash of winning a national championship. So I was on the first gold emblem team from the state of Alabama ever, which is something I was very proud of. And then you fast forward a few years, and because my dad was an ag teacher and because I was still around the FFA and helped out with a lot of their events, that kind of thing, I just happened to be at the district level debate competition. And I went to that, but this is a few years after I've been out of high school. I'm not wearing the FFA official dress anymore that has my name and chapter and everything on it. So I'm just dressed like a normal guy, probably wearing something pretty similar to what I'm wearing right now. And I go back to one of these events. And there was a girl outside in the hall, had no idea who I was. Like I said, I've been out of high school for a few years now, so I'm no longer, as well known as I was back when I was in it and was a state officer. And one of the girls outside is from the other team, not Marbury, a different chapter. And she starts talking about how, to somebody else, not to me, but I happen to be sitting very near her, about how, yeah, Marbury's about to go in and, they win every year because they cheat. And was talking about how they're cheaters and they wind up getting everything they get because they're not playing by the rules or whatever. Now, I know that's a load of crap because, first of all, my dad's the coach. And I was on the team, so I know that we're just that much better than everybody else because we work harder than them. It's no deep, dark secret. But anyway, I say all that to set this up because at this point I told her, I was like, well, really, tell me how they cheat. And she didn't have an answer. She doesn't know how they're cheating. She just knows that they are. And I said, you better be careful about what you say to people because you never know who might be listening. Then you fast forward 3 months, and the state convention happens 3 months after that, and she comes into her prepared public speaking event, and I saw when she looked over at me, her eyes got this big because I was her judge. And I didn't hold it against the child. I wound up giving her third place because I thought that that was the position that she had earned. I thought she was the third best speaker there, and I even told her that afterwards, like, just so you know, I didn't hold that against you. I didn't want to. But the reason that I bring that up is this is the position that the Romans find themselves in. They don't understand what they're doing, but eventually every human being that has ever walked this earth is going to find out who the judge actually is. They don't always recognize him as soon as they see him. We see this playing out very realistically in real time in the Gospel of Mark here, but eventually everybody's going to figure out who the judge actually is. And so because of that, I think that it's interesting that we're seeing this parody of royalty and this parody of fidelity to Christ and his rule being played out when eventually every knee is going to bow for real that time. And so it's sort of a precursor to when Christ is actually going to come into his kingdom. Right, and then verse 21, and this is, I know it may look weird that I have this verse by itself, but I have a reason for this. It says, they pressed into service a passerby coming from the country, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. So a little background on this one. Cyrene is a Greek colony in North Africa, and it's located in modern-day Libya, so it's in the Mediterranean area, but it's pretty far off. So this Simon guy, whoever he is, he's traveled a pretty long way in order to be in Jerusalem at the Passover. And only Mark mentions the names of his sons. So we have to ask ourselves, why is that? Why is this seemingly completely meaningless detail of two people that are not even present in the story and have nothing to do with the story included? And when you do a little bit of digging, I think that the most logical explanation, and some of this comes in with studying some traditions of the early church, a tradition holds that Simon and his sons were prominent leaders in the early church. That this man who just happened to be there far from home in Jerusalem for this 1 week to celebrate the Passover and just happened to be standing there when the Roman soldiers are like, we need some guy to carry this cross because this guy clearly can't do it anymore. You over there, you come here. This person that was seemingly chosen at random is actually probably the whole thing's being orchestrated by the Holy Spirit, because it seems as though this person and his two sons became prominent leaders in the early church. Simon is a Jewish name, Alexander is a Greek name, and Rufus is a Latin name. And Rufus also might be mentioned in Romans 16:13. So you might remember that Paul usually gives a list of salutations at the beginning or the end of his epistles. And when he's writing to the church at Rome, he mentions Rufus, which would suggest that this is probably the same guy. Because this is a Jew that was living in a Greek province, which was controlled by Rome at the time. And he has two sons with non-Jewish names, which means he probably intermarried, married somebody that wasn't a Jew, or maybe he did marry a Jew, but he just gave them names that would have been more prominent to other people. And remember that Mark's audience is primarily Roman. And we also see this other guy, also named Rufus, mentioned in the salutations of the early church when he's writing a letter to Rome. I mean, it could be a coincidence, but that seems to be pretty strong evidence that the Rufus that's being talked about in the book of Romans, that's an early church leader that Paul mentions, is also the same Rufus of this man who happened to be the person who carried Jesus' cross. And if that is the case, that's pretty astounding, the levels of divine providence that are going on here to reach out to this man. If Simon did become a Christian as well, then it parallels the binding of Isaac in Genesis 22. Because you'll remember what happens in that story is that Isaac carries the wood on his back that is to be his own sacrifice. That he's supposed to go up on the mountain and to be killed and burned on that pyre. And yet what happens is that when they get to the top, he's set free and a lamb takes his place. And so we're seeing this very strong symbolism paralleled in the story of Simon and the story of Christ. That actually a lamb is going to be provided by God to take his place so that Simon, a guilty man, a sinful man, is going to be pardoned on behalf of Christ. So let's look at very quickly Mark 15, 22 through 26. Then they brought him to the place Golgotha, which is translated place of the skull. They tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided up his garments among themselves, casting lots for them to decide what each man should take. It was the third hour when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, King of the Jews. So the myrrh here used is a substance, a concoction that was used to mitigate pain. And we do have historic records that this was something that was known to the medical community at the time, and that there were Jewish women that would create this in order to give to the prisoners and the accused to try to lessen the pain that they were about to undergo, which makes sense because crucifixion is arguably the most painful way to die. In fact, the word excruciating, you can hear the crux in there. The word cross actually comes out, that's the root word of excruciating. So the worst word for pain we have even in the English language is based off of the cross. And so it makes sense that they would want this potion to be given to people to try to ease that pain at least a little bit, but yet Christ refuses it. He wants to feel the full force of what is about to come, which is in and of itself brave and heroic.
Let us not also forget that he was whipped senselessly just a few hours prior to that.
Right, and the Mark account includes that, as it talks about him being beaten and scourged as well. And so that's a good point to bring up, is that this is not his first bout with pain for the day. He already was feeling pain when this was offered to him, and he still said no. Historic records do confirm the taking of the victim's possessions, and this was often a bonus for the soldiers in charge. So people didn't actually want to volunteer for crucifixion duty normally if you were a Roman soldier. And so you got to kind of keep whatever the prisoners had on them at the time, and so that was kind of seen as a bonus. But I want you to think about that. These are literally the only worldly possessions Jesus has. You know, we see in other parts of the gospel, or other accounts of the gospel, I should say, that Jesus didn't even have a pillow to lay his head or a home to call his own. The man literally has nothing except the clothes on his back. And at this point, they even take that away from him. Now, there is some dispute amongst scholars as to whether Jesus was naked or not. Roman tradition would hold that victims had to be completely naked when they were crucified. That was the common thing. The Jews would provide somebody a loincloth whenever they were being executed, whether they were being stoned or whatever. It was Jewish tradition, because of, the ideas of Jewish decency, you wouldn't stone them in all of their clothes, but you would provide some kind of loincloth for them so that they weren't completely naked when they died. The Romans didn't have any kind of scruples about that. Now, maybe they allowed for that because this was in a Jewish providence, but there's no record to confirm that. So it's very possible, not only is Jesus being humiliated, mocked, tortured, all of those things, but on top of that, he's also up there completely naked and exposed. And so this would have been shameful for anybody, but especially for a Jew that held modesty in such high regard. And so this is the ultimate form of embarrassment and torture. And I will end on this. I hate that we didn't have time to get through more of this, but ultimately when reading through Mark's gospel and Mark's account of the crucifixion and resurrection, and really just kind of a general summary of the Gospel of Mark, the Roman sentimentality has always been centered on power. Who's the most powerful, who has the power, who has the right to wield power over other people. That's kind of their core value. Their highest virtue is getting power and then using that power for your own benefit. That's always the way that the Romans have seen the world. And yet, in the letter of Mark, he tries to emphasize the fact that this is the guy with the actual power. And the greatest virtue that he has is choosing not to use it when he doesn't have to. It's meekness, power under control. And that comes to its full fruition in the crucifixion account that Mark gives. This is a person that was holding all the cards, had all the power, could have destroyed anybody standing there that he wanted to, and yet he chose not to. That's real power, having the strength to control yourself and understand when to and to not use your power. That's the ultimate form of virtue in Mark's gospel. So I appreciate your time and attention. I'll leave you with that.